Well, thank you very much for a really, really insightful panel. And I think indeed perhaps the first, or at least certainly one of the first, after the recent conclusion of the summit. Of course, many experts here. And what experts often do, they get sort of lost in the heat of the moment, the excitement of the moment. I want to bring in and introduce my uncle Gerhard, who predictably tends to call me after these summits completely flummoxed and ask me, so what happened here? Now, he didn't do it 20 years ago, but I would like to go back to 1995, where I can easily imagine he's sitting at the breakfast table and he's reading the newspaper and he sees there's a COP in Berlin and all kinds of divisions emerged between developing and developed countries. Negotiations were tough. He doesn't yet know even that the United States a year later will unanimously in the Senate resolve never to commit to anything that doesn't meet very strict conditions. He says to his wife, to my aunt, listen, I thought, wasn't it just a little while ago that in Rio everybody was cheering and shaking hands? It seemed such a success. Okay, 10 years later, he's reading the newspaper again in 2005. And he sees a story about Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, Joke Waller-Hunter, who unfortunately is no longer with us. And the international community again cheering the Kyoto Protocol is entered into force against all kinds of odds. And he's again flummoxed. He said, wait a minute, wasn't there this thing in The Hague, the breakdown just a short while ago, and President Bush withdrawing from the climate negotiation? I don't get it. And now it's 2015, and he calls me again, and then this time he really did, and said, hey, just a few years ago, there was this Brokenhagen, you know, this total collapse, I thought, of multilateralism in Copenhagen. And here I hear that there's this total revival of multilateralism. What is going on? What I think is really remarkable about it is not sort of each individual installment. And there are the ups and downs, the highs and lows, and they will keep happening. But the fact that this is a quarter of a century of consistent and consecutive negotiations. And that, I think, really is so important. Harro rightly says that, of course, the implementation, the hard work of putting all this into action will happen at the national, subnational, local level, through private actors, through non-state actors, and that is entirely correct. But I think at the same time, as Mark Pausy rightly put it, it's this process that has kept us focused for a quarter of a century, brought us back to the table every year and during the year, more often than the negotiators surely would wish, given their exhaustion and fatigue. But it has brought us back, and it has focused our attention, and it has guided us. I'm German, and I think, and I can say really, I think with conviction, that the targets that we have in Germany for renewables, for greenhouse gas mitigation, for energy efficiency, for transport efficiency improvements, etc., all would not have been put in place the way they are without having that beacon up, in the lofty sky that has been put into multilateral instruments over time. Now, of course, much of this can be brought back right to the UNFCCC, which I think is a remarkable, remarkable instrument. It's nearly universal in participation. All UN members are parties to it, and some others, such as Palestine. Pretty much no other treaty has such universal, inclusive participation. Some people say it's an empty shell. It only sets out vague principles, some general objectives, and it really didn't mean very much. But I think that's not true. If we look at the objectives and principles, they accompany and frame the negotiations to this very day, and they were ever present for the people in Paris as well. The institutions it created, the Climate Convention Secretariat has 500 people. The Ozone Secretariat, which is sort of considered the model, the framework, protocol approach, has less than 20. The capacity and resources that are represented and reflected in this institutional framework are remarkable. The WTO, the Secretariat of the WTO, the main institutional framework for international trade, you would expect must be much, much larger. It's only barely maybe 100 people larger than the Climate Convention Secretariat. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. The Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Accord, the Paris Agreement, they're all very much embedded in the process that was set in motion in the late 80s and early 90s, and then with the UNFCCC when it entered into force in 1994. But it is also true that this inclusiveness, these lofty aspirations of the multilateral process that is happening under the auspices of the United Nations, comes at a price. So it's very unwieldy. It is very complex. And I think the panel gave us a good sense of how difficult it is to get all these different actors with all their different circumstances into one room, to one table, and to try to agree on something, to compromise on something. So its strength at the same time makes it in many ways vulnerable. And as every success has been followed by a setback, and I imagine it will happen again, you know, we have heard calls for alternative venues. We have to look elsewhere. This UN process is just stalling us. This is an urgent problem. We need to move forward. We need to look elsewhere. Harro rightly said that much of this thinking, at least in scholarship, emerged in the United States. Now, for over half a century, the United States, it's no surprise, has been, you know, very beholden to the realist school of international relations of Hans Morgenthau, George Kennan, and others that held a very good skepticism, good deal of skepticism about the power of international law and institutions. But I think it was another moment that really kick-started what happened, this sort of shift or this move away from faith and confidence in the United Nations process. I mean, after all, President Bush in Rio signed the UNFCCC and it entered into force. No, but let's go back there in history. These negotiations started in the late 80s. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, etc. Yes, 1992 is when this treaty was signed, but the negotiations started earlier. But in 1990, recall, a massive development in international relations happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is where Charles Krauthammer wrote about the unipolar moment in history. Francis Fukuyama thought we'd reached the end of history. Think about it. If you are the mightiest, the unipolar power, the hegemon in international relations, do you really want to constrain your power, make yourself accountable to international institutions, to big and small nations? Or is it not actually much nicer to be unfettered by all this? So I think a lot of that thinking about alternatives, which quickly manifested itself, the Senate resolution that I mentioned, bipartisan, across both parties, unanimity in the Senate saying we will not ratify a treaty that, you know, commits us to certain things if it doesn't also include all kinds of, at that time, unrealistic elements. David Victor, you know, a scholar that Harro and I get many headaches over, but also enjoy reading, of course. Even before the Kyoto Protocol had a chance to enter into force, he already wrote about its collapse. Of course, President Bush withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol in 2001. I think, especially in the case of the United States, at least, you can see this sort of skepticism vis-a-vis multilateralism and so UN-led or anything under the auspices of the UN in its track record of ratifying international conventions, which is absolutely dismal. The UNFCCC is a rare exception, really a glimmer of light. So that, I think, the United States driving sort of this bottom-up agenda of, you know, moving away, looking for alternatives, plus the very legitimate concern, the very legitimate urgency that we weren't moving fast enough on climate policy, we weren't doing enough, were both drivers of looking for these alternatives. And there were all kinds of calls for alternatives, and there were all kinds of things that happened. The proliferation of, you know, minilateral, we've talked about climate clubs, minilateralism emerged, bilateral cooperation. We've seen all kinds of informal or semi-formal fora starting to adopt the agenda, and this is something Harro has written and thought about at length. You know, the major economies meeting, turning into the Major Economies Forum, and the Clean Energy Ministerial, Asia-Pacific, all kinds of these forums. G8, G20, all of them have dealt with climate change. And I wonder, you know, are these really that much better? The G20 in 2009 already pledged to phase out fossil fuels in Pittsburgh at their meeting. How far have we really gotten on that? All these other groups that keep meeting predictably and regularly say, and we are only complementary to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations, because they very much know that they cannot agree miraculously on something that's that much more ambitious and will solve the problem that much better. Entities like the WTO go out of their way of saying, no, 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 please don't bring it to us. You know, that's where it belongs. Because you would simply and only import the same divisions between China and the United States, between India and the between different factions if you try to reduce it to other fora. That at least is my opinion. And that, I think, is why we haven't seen, a revolutionary, a miraculous shift. So right now, multilateralism, or the faith in multilateralism, sees restored for the moment. But I'm quite sure that my Uncle Gerhard will call me again in a few years and say, well, so President Trump withdrew from the, I thought it was binding, what's going on here? Or the stock-taking exercise turns into a horrible collapse of international negotiations. Or. There are many questions and many challenges that still have to be overcome as we move forward with the Paris Agreement. So I would certainly urge us to not overestimate the potential of alternatives to the multilateral process, and I would urge us not to underestimate what it has achieved. It has, as most panelists I think also said before, it has achieved the remarkable thing that large and small countries, powerful and not so powerful nations, rich and poor nations, have had to come to the table and talk about it in a forum which, if you've read Philip Allott of Cambridge, you know that international law is very, very far from an ideal democratic setting in which everybody is equal and accountable, etc. No, he describes it as sort of, the non-elected, not necessarily very legitimate bureaucrats of governments coming together to negotiate things in smoke-filled rooms. I think that's a bit too pessimistic, but there's certainly a long, long way to go. But at the same time, and as Felipe said, it is the forum where a small country will have a voice just as much as a large, large country with a GDP that may be 100 times as large. Do we want to abandon this achievement that was fought over with blood and bloodshed, warfare, etc., and reflected in the Westphalian Treaty? Do we want to abandon that before we've really found a better alternative? I think not. No, I really think rather that we have now this opportunity to use what the Paris Agreement and the negotiations in the last few years have seen happen, namely to use the bigger involvement, even through formal channels of civil society, of the private sector, of sub-national jurisdictions, to make climate cooperation more accountable, more transparent, more democratic ultimately. And if we do that and seize that opportunity, then I think in a few years my uncle finally will not call me anymore and think, this is good, it's been tackled somehow. Thank you.